Well, my biography of Edward is called The Unconventional King because for the time he lived in, he was extremely unconventional and unusual. So royal and noble men of the Middle Ages always enjoyed jousting, for example. Edward never jousted. So Edward preferred to get dirty with peasants, we might say. So he jumped into trenches and ditches. He picked up a spade and he joined in. He thatched roofs. He enjoyed working with metalwork. So he enjoyed like popping in to chat to his blacksmith and to watch them work. So not only did he participate in these kind of jobs or occupations, he also watched other people doing them. So this makes him extremely unusual for his time because kings weren't supposed to do that sort of thing, let's face it. And another aspect of Edward's behaviour is that he very much enjoyed the company of the people who performed these tasks. So my own research has shown that he often popped into the chat to his blacksmiths. When he sailed along the River Thames, he chatted to fishermen. He even waded into the water of the Thames to buy his own fish himself with his own hands. So this is the kind of unusual person that Edward was. He was very much ahead of his time. So his kind of behaviour wouldn't be so unusual today. We might even see him as a great role model. A man who loved the outdoors, he enjoyed rowing and swimming, for example. He enjoyed fishing. So he enjoyed these quite active outdoor pursuits. And he also enjoyed the company of fishermen, carters, blacksmiths, shipwrights, these kind of people. And if he was, say Prince Harry, we might approve of this. We might think, great, there's a prince with a common touch. That's really great. He doesn't just hang out with, the upper class people. He gets down, he likes the lower class people as well. But to Edward's contemporaries, this was quite shocking. And he actually got a lot of criticism for it. And I think in another way, he was quite openly a lover of men, and I think that's also something which is perhaps seems more modern. Like one chronicle refers to him and his favourite or his lover, Hugh Despenser, as the king as his husband. And in a country where gay marriage has only recently been made legal, I think, in so many ways, Edward seems to be 700 years ahead of his time. Edward's reign, because it was kind of only 20 years, so it's comparatively short, and it's kind of sandwiched between the much longer and the much more successful reigns of his father, Edward I, and his son, Edward III. And because Edward was a failure as a king, and he ended up being deposed, a lot of chroniclers were written after his reign with the knowledge that he had failed, and they perhaps judged him more harshly than they perhaps otherwise would have done. So, for example, we have one chronicle, the Vita Edwardi Secundi. The author probably died or became incapacitated before Edward's deposition. So this is like a much more reliable source because it ends at the end of 1325, a year before Edward's deposition, when it wasn't written with the knowledge of Edward's later deposition. But I think the chroniclers did really put the boot in him quite a lot, and of course a lot of modern writers have done as well. A lot of this is justified, of course. I mean, Edward was a disastrous ruler. There's no denying that he deserves criticism for a lot of his actions. But I think a lot of the criticism has been unfair, and a lot of stories have been invented about him that show him in a very bad light, which when you look at them are actually just complete modern inventions. They're not based on any medieval source whatsoever. So my aim as a historian has also been to really go back to the sources, to look at what's true about Edward and what isn't. For example, a story that he stole his wife's children from her in 1324 when he went to war against her brother, the King of France, and wanted to punish her emotionally. This was invented in the late 1970s, for example, and it's been repeated ever since. As though it's a certain fact, and it was just invented, in modern times. So this is one example of the things I've been trying to do with Edward. To get back to the truth, the chroniclers of the 14th century all say that Edward was an enormously strong man. He was immensely physically powerful. One chronicler calls him one of the strongest men in England. Whereas in Braveheart, he's portrayed as this foppish, feeble, weak, hopeless character. I mean, it's completely, entirely and utterly wrong. And I think, some of the criticism of Edward has perhaps been, and I'm not saying that all of it or even most or much of it, but some of it, in my opinion, has been rooted in this kind of homophobia, where he is judged more harshly because he wasn't heterosexual. He was, homosexual or bisexual. And I think sometimes that has been an element in the criticism of him. What I've often noticed is that we don't know for sure that Isabella and Mortimer were lovers. We don't know for sure that Edward II and his male favourites, such as Piers Gaveston and Hugh Despenser, were lovers. But in modern times, Roger Mortimer is always inevitably called Isabella's lover, whereas the Edward II's men are always just called his favourite. So there's I think a real I don't know, almost a prejudice here, or like a kind of heteronormativity, which I find quite irritating, to be honest. So I think in modern times the relationship of Isabella and Mortimer has been excessively romanticised. I mean, I wouldn't say for sure that I know they weren't lovers. They might well have gone to bed together sometimes, but we don't know that. We certainly don't know that they were madly in love. I mean, there's no source that tells us they were madly in love. So I think it's been very much overwritten and over-romanticised in later centuries, whereas Edward's relationships with his men, which were perhaps also, quite intense, long-lasting and, quite powerful relationships, kind of tend to be underplayed. So again, I'm not saying for sure that I know Edward, had sex with his male favourites. I'm just saying it's possible, and that these relationships were very intense, very important, because Edward's relationship with Hugh Despencer actually brought him down in 1326-27. So this same-sex relationship actually brought about the downfall of a king of England for the first time. So I think we need to maybe focus a bit more on Edward's relationships rather than underplaying them and say, oh no, they were just friends. No, they weren't lovers. No. So I do find a lot of double standards between the same-sex relationships and the opposite-sex relationships in the way these relationships are written about, even in the 21st century. We have a lot of evidence that Edward did die at Berkeley Castle in 1327, and we have also an awful lot of evidence that he didn't die, and this evidence really seems irreconcilable. So all the chroniclers say that he died at Berkeley Castle in September 1327, even if they didn't know how, and they speculated wildly as to the cause of the death. And of course, it's beyond all doubt that Edward was buried, or let's say his funeral was held at Gloucester in December 1327, and that a lot of people acted as though he was dead. But then 2-3 years later, a lot of people, influential people, including the Archbishop of York, for example, started to act as though they believed that Edward was not in fact dead after all. And the Archbishop of York stated outright in a letter, our liege Lord Edward of Carnarvon is alive and in good physical health and in a safe place. And then we have the Fieschi letters written by an Italian bishop in the 1330s, explaining to Edward III how Edward II escaped from Berkeley and ultimately ended up in a hermitage south of Milan in Italy. So the question is how on earth do we reconcile these two positions? And it's very difficult. For a long time, I tended to believe that Edward did die in 1327. I now tend to the belief that he probably didn't. Because I can understand why a king would have been presented as dead, because there were a lot of plots to save him. So saying that he was dead actually saved the position of his son and his wife. But I can't see why there would be all this evidence that people believe that he wasn't dead if he actually was. So I tend now to come down on the side that he survived past 1327. I'm not sure that he necessarily ended up in Italy, but maybe he did. It's a nice thought. It makes me happy. I think Edward just made so many mistakes. Both as a ruler, as a king, and as a war leader. He couldn't conquer Scotland, and this was a major factor. In his downfall. He couldn't control his own nobles. He did so many things wrong, and I don't ever want to to gloss over all his many faults and his mistakes. That I find him a very likable person. Perhaps because he was such a likable person, he was also a disastrous ruler. He just didn't have that capacity for ruling that his father and his son had. So I think we should acknowledge all his faults and his errors, but perhaps we should also remember that he was born into a hereditary monarchy. He didn't choose that position; he was born into it. So although yes, he failed, but he didn't have any choice about becoming King of England. So perhaps we shouldn't judge him quite as harshly as we would say a modern disastrous politician who actually chose to be in that position. And as I said, I think a lot of the stories that are told about Edward II are actually just much more recent or modern inventions. So I really want to go back to the primary sources, and I don't think no one is ever going to say Edward was a good king. But I hope I can show with my work that he was a fatally flawed man, but he was a fascinating one. He was a very likable one in many ways. So he had a lot of contradictions in his character. His reign is incredibly dramatic. It's a really fascinating period of English history. So although I always think that he will come, fairly near the bottom of the list of English monarchs, and but that's okay. As long as people treat him fairly, and don't, repeat all these silly stories invented about him in much later centuries, that sits well with me.